Okay, look, we'll start to kick into it. I think we've got everyone on, which is great. So look, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai, and welcome to tonight's webinar on trial and selection processes in youth sport. My name's Alex Chiet. I'll be your host for this evening. I'd like to start with a karakia. This karakia is about bringing us together, settling the forces around us before we start this webinar. So te taua mai runga, te taua mai raro, te taua mai roto, te taua mai waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, kia tau ai te Māori ora, tūturu whakamawa, kia tina, tina. So look, just a huge thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar this evening. It's great to see we've got great numbers on the call tonight. Tonight's topic is trial and selection processes in youth sport. And if not well managed, as I'm sure many of us understand, it's actually a trigger for people changing sport, or unfortunately, people dropping out and disengaging with sport. So as we will appreciate, it's a very complex area and something really challenging to get right practically, hence why we're having a conversation about it tonight. While we're getting ready to go, you'll see on your right-hand side, there's a few polls that pop up. So we'll be running a few polls through the evening. It'd be really great if you could engage with those and interact with us. So the first one should be there now. And it's asking, what's the main hat you're wearing as you come onto this poll this evening? So whether you're a coach, an administrator, a parent, or a parent coach. Obviously, you may wear a few hats, but it'd be great if you could choose the main hat you're wearing. And from looking at things, we've got a big coaching cohort and a big administrator cohort, which is great. So welcome. That will help us, myself and the panelists, with how we answer questions tonight. And you'll also find a chat function on the right-hand side. So if you have questions as we go through things tonight, please just jot them into that chat function. We'll do our best to answer them throughout the evening, or sort of see what the themes are and then tackle some of those themes. So just a few things to touch on in terms of IT. So technically, if you have any technical issues with the video or the connection tonight, just log out and log back on through the link that you received. If you're still having any problems, there's a contact email that came with the email for registration, so you can contact someone there. So hopefully we're all ready to go. So you'll see some faces on the screen. So time to sort of introduce the panel of guests we've got tonight. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Bjorn Dix, who's the Community Development Officer for Wellington Hockey Association. Kia ora, Bjorn. How are you doing tonight? Not sure if Bjorn's... Oh, you're there, Bjorn? Okay, I'll go over to Chris. We've also got Chris Campbell on the call. Chris is a sports activator at Upper Hutt College in Wellington. Good evening, Chris.
Yeah, how you going?
Good. You can hear me loud and clear?
Yeah. No, we're good at this end.
Oh, brilliant. Welcome, Chris. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dave Wright. Dave's a high-performance athlete development consultant at High Performance Sport New Zealand. Welcome, Dave. You're looking forward to tonight's discussion?
Yeah, hi, Alex. Thanks for having me, and really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Dave. It's great to hear you. I'll just come back to Bjorn. Bjorn, can you hear us?
Yeah, I think I've got my technical glitches sorted now. So
good, man. Welcome, Bjorn. Great to have you here. So just to frame tonight up, the purpose of tonight really is to raise awareness of the complexities of selections and trials. It's to discuss what good looks like, or in some cases, what better looks like, and hopefully provide some practical tips. So whether you're a parent, a coach, or administrator, hopefully there's something here for you all to take away. And from talking to the panel tonight, Bjorn, Chris, and Dave, in preparation for the call, I'm really confident there's some great golden nuggets in here that you'll all be able to take away. So there'll be 3 sections tonight that we're going to take you through. The first one, we're just going to have a discussion around some of the pitfalls and challenges in this space, and there's a lot of unintended consequences that play out when we don't get these sort of trial and selection processes quite right. I'll then frame up a basic framework, just something for us to think about, and each panel member will discuss sort of that framework and connect with work that they've been part of. And the way we've set tonight up as well as each panel member is looking from a different perspective, sort of intermediate age, secondary school age, and from the performance perspective, moving into the performance space. So hopefully that'll give us some really good perspectives to apply to the part of the sports system that you're operating in. We've just had our second poll pop up. So before we throw the first question over, there's another poll to interact with. This time, it'd be really helpful if you could give us an indication of what development stage you work with. So either in that junior tamariki space, which is 5 to 11, youth participation for rangatahi, so, they're participating, or otherwise, again, rangatahi in the youth development space, but starting to move into performance. Oh, great. Look, so we've got good to see that we're primarily a youth-focused audience tonight, which is great. We all got the memo, and a few in that youth junior space as well. So, look, let's get into the questions. So this first phase, as I stated, it's all about some of the pitfalls and challenges. So I'm going to direct my first question to Bjorn. Bjorn, working in that community and development space for hockey, I know you've been through a lot of work there, but be really keen to understand, why you think trials and selection processes are such a challenge and are so emotive. And that's sort of for, the players, the parents, and the coaches. It does seem to be quite a challenging space. So, how do you connect with that?
I guess it comes from a place we see of everyone sort of wanting what they deem as best. So players, they obviously have a bit of anxiety around the grading aspect, around trials and where they'll end up, and they're not sure what that's going to look like for them. Will they be with their friends or will they not? Parents, they want to know, they want the best for their kid, and they only go off what they know or what they think the best opportunity potentially looks like. And again, coaches, it's a bit of a mixture. Generally, coaches sometimes want to be working with the best kids to create the best teams that they can work with. Or conversely, like a lot of administrators, they find it really challenging around that selection process and how to avoid disappointment for kids and that. So there's plenty of challenges when you were working with young people in this space.
Yeah, and the good thing I'm hearing is you're well aware of that emotive environment and how different people are looking at these processes, Bjorn. So, and understanding that, is there anything that you sort of do or message to help alleviate some of those sort of stresses that float around?
Yeah, we try to engage as best we can, and then just have conversations and encourage conversations and encourage to be challenged at times, and explain why. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well, but that's certainly something we can do more of and be better at. But again, it's not being afraid to have conversations.
That's great. Thanks, Bjorn. Now, Chris, I'm moving to you. So we use this word unintended consequences quite often. Looking at trials and selections from a secondary school sort of space within a secondary school, what are some of the unintended consequences you've seen through trials and selection processes?
Yeah, look, I don't think they're going to be too dissimilar to other age groups, and probably ones that were quite predictable and we're probably expecting to see. A huge unintended consequence for us, and we'll know if the trial hasn't gone particularly well, is that extra workload. But I think that stems from the poor communication prior, during, and post the trial. So that can cause you massive headaches, dealing with disgruntled parents, disappointed kids, and chances are your trial's been run at a really busy time of the year. You've possibly got lots of other sports going on, and different grades starting up. So if you can alleviate the extra stuff that you need to that comes in, you're off to a flyer. So we've all had the emails around the trial was unfair. My daughter only got 20 minutes in her third position. My son was in the A team last year, now he's in the Bs. But I think for me, the biggest consequence, if it's not done right, is that the students themselves lose that motivation and disinterest in the sport. So that might be down to not being in a team with their friends. The team that they made might not be at the level of participation that they want to get into. It might not be competitive enough. It might be too hard. And we know that it's a really crucial age, the secondary space, that the decisions that they make and the sports that they decide to play now, chances are going to have a big impact on what they do in later life as well. So it's a lot of things can go wrong. It is a bit of a complex beast, but just try and support everyone as best we can to get the experience that they want.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in there, Chris, and a lot of things I probably want to unpack a little bit more, and we'll get a chance to do that. So as we sort of move through this, Dave, I'm sort of moving over to you now, and Why do you sort of believe that the selection and trial process continue to occur? I'll use the word too early, and sometimes the processes aren't quite, they're pretty poor sometimes. So, why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, look, I think there are some challenges around high performance narratives seeping too early and too deep into sport, when we need to be realistic around what high performance is, and that it's really for the exceptional minority of people, and generally comes later. And depending on different sports, there's different performance ages for those sports. But, I think there can be a rush. We live in a culture where status is really prevalent. Social media puts a lot of pressure on young people. And I saw a quote recently this week in the lead up to this, which I thought really was relevant, around social comparison as the thief of joy. And there's a lot of research out there around, psychology and positive psychology around the importance of autonomy, supportive environments. And I think comparing athletes can be quite dangerous when you're especially looking at the audience, given a lot of them are working with youth. Those athletes in that stage are going to be at very different points in terms of growth and maturation and so on. So we have to be careful that those HP narratives don't sort of seep too low, and that premature professionalism doesn't become too dominant. The words elite, produce, and product, for me, are dangerous words in sport, and frankly shouldn't be used at any level. We're talking about a human activity with human complexity here. And when it comes to identifying athletes, sometimes we know what we're looking for, but we don't always know what we're looking at. So I think that's sort of a bit of a summary, that those narratives getting too low can often be quite dangerous when it comes to the experience of the participant.
Yeah.
Just lost your audio there, Alex.
Am I back now?
You are.
Okay, apologies. There was a vacuum cleaner in the background before, so I thought I'd better spare you all from that. It should have been me doing the vacuuming. Look, the quote you sort of used there, that social comparisons, the theft of joy, is pretty powerful. And I think, we start to talk here, and you sort of alluded to every individual developing at different rates, and therefore when these processes occur and how they occur is so important, which is sort of what we're going to start to move into in terms of what good looks like. And it's also quite powerful hearing that narrative coming from someone that works in the high performance system as well. So look, there's a few, I'm just keeping an eye too, for those, that you're listening in and joining us, feel free to fire questions into that chat function. So there might be things bubbling around in your head. If it's bubbling around in your head, I'm sure it's someone else is thinking the same thing. So, we've just touched on the complexity of this space, and I'm sure everyone's, familiar with what's involved here. Now we're sort of going to move into, well, okay, we understand this complexity a little bit. We know it's challenging. Well, how do we start to, demonstrate some good practice? What does better look like? So one thing I would like to reinforce before we sort of get into that is it is actually really important that young people that have the motivation, attitude, and commitment are extended and stretched to support their development. And that's both, physically, emotionally, tactically, in their preferred sport. And this obviously then requires, a selection process or a trial at the right time. But the challenge I think we all face is how it's done, how those processes are put in place, and that there are actually consistent processes there, and they are actually looking at the whole person. And that, from when we start to make these selections, it's really important that there are opportunities for other people to still play. It's not a you're in and you're out. It's also not you're in for good, that there's entry and exit points later, and it's not you're shutting the gate. And we're also very aware that, resourcing and time's a challenge when we start to head into these processes, especially if we're putting better practice in the youth space. So what I'm going to do really quickly over sort of a couple of minutes is just frame up a really basic framework that the panelists will connect to when we start to move into the next discussion. So in terms of this framework, look, the first thing, really, in a sense, quite obvious, and something that gets talked about, is making sure that we're thinking of the person first. Talked about a lot, but a lot often easier said than done. So, it's a no-brainer, but quite often it gets forgotten about or not thought through as much as it could or should. In there, you'll also see that this word holistic, hauora, however you'd like to sort of frame it, but actually looking at the whole person, not just the physical, technical, tactical. And the other thing in here is how we look at these processes in and out. So when young people are in this selection or trial process, as well as what happens when we come out. So really ensuring we're thinking about both steps there. The next sort of piece of the framework I'd like just to frame up and is actually the purpose. Like, do we actually need to have a trial or a selection process? Is it required? Or is this just something that has been there and it's just tradition and we just keep doing it because we've always done it? So it's just another really important consideration to think about the purpose of it. And wrapped up into that is, well, how does it connect with competition? So what's the competitive purpose or the development purpose that we're actually selecting some youth for a certain event or program? Just being really clear about why we're doing it. Because the question might be where it's not required. And the last sort of point in this basic framework before I throw over to the panelists is just thinking about the environment itself and the systems within the environment. So communication, Chris, you touched on this earlier, but communication so before this trial or selection process, during, what are the messages during, and also afterwards. We've probably all been or seen processes where people don't know what's happening. They get there, something goes on, and then, they're told they make it or they don't afterwards. And there's just so much more we could do if we're actually putting the young person first. How it should feel. So when people actually come to these trial and selection processes, our rangatahi, are people there welcoming them, creating a nice mood in terms of the environment, or, are there clipboards out, people are walking around? It's quite emotive as such, rather than actually bringing people in, helping them feel comfortable and express themselves in a play-like environment. So even the language and the words that are used are really important and impressionable with young people. I won't go into too much detail, but is this a one-off trial, or is there a few trials, or actually is this an ongoing evaluation where we're continually looking at young people? And then we actually get into what we're actually looking for. Is it deficit-based or strength-based? Are we looking at the physical, technical things, and how are we looking at them? They're more quantitative. We can measure some of those things. The character is more qualitative. How are we making judgments about those things? Do we know the young people? Have we talked to other people that do? And then quite often it's not one person involved in these processes. There's half a dozen, or there's a couple of people. Have we actually taken the time to talk as a group of people that are involved to make sure we all understand the processes and what we're looking for? And the final point sort of from me here is, the weighting of, well, some of the character traits and people that might know these young people may have coached them for 3 or 4 years before this trial process, versus people that may have only seen them briefly in 1 or 2 sort of sessions where they may have only touched a ball or done something a few times. And, are we putting a weighting on people that have been involved with these young people beforehand? And, there's some really simple questions and things we can do there. So, this little framework I've just sort of framed up, just wanted to make sure that we could all sort of connect with it. The panelists are going to be asked the question. What's going to happen is they're going to give you a little bit of their context, so where they work at in a development sense in terms of the environment they're in or the environment they're supporting, what they've done differently in terms of trials and selections, and then what they've learned. Because as we all understand, we never get it right the first time. We're always learning, we're always evolving. So, to start with, I'm coming to you again, Bjorn. As sort of mentioned earlier, as part of your role, you work with hockey clubs and coaches and players, both in that sort of participation and development space. So you're looking, the conversation we're going to have is more at that intermediate age, year 7 and 8, sort of moving up. So go for it, Bjorn. Really keen to hear about the work that you've been part of with Wellington Hockey.
Yeah, we've been on this journey for a wee while, Alex, as you know. Hockey New Zealand have probably led the way in the significant changes we've made. They've moved away from hosting national tournaments, and they've gone to more regional models, which are more festival-based, and a lot of major sports are doing the same. So previously, for context, in the under-13, year 7 and 8 space, we'd hold trials to select an A and a B team, and the A team would head off to a national tournament, and the B team would head away to a a regional festival with a development focus. So any players who came to those trials and missed out on those 2 teams, there wasn't anything for them, and they sort of left with nothing. Coupled with that, coaches also applied to coach the teams. So you'd have coaches send their CV in and go through a selection process to take a team away to a tournament, where generally when that starts happening, sort of results and outcome focuses become the main drivers and the main weight to why they're applying and why they're coaching. So we've looked to change both of those aspects. So in the traditional model, we generally had about 50 girls, 50 boys that would put their names forward in that under 13 space to come and trial. So just over 100 in total. So the new model that we've transitioned to, like I touched on, Alex has been part of this shift as well. There's been previous steps in that previous model, which we undertook to try and help get us to where we are. Where we are now is we have an in-season development program, and that runs through term 3. It's self-nominated, so players attending, they'll come along to 2 development days. These days we'll have a whole lot of different coaches and trainers involved. The players will go through different skill stations and different games, modified games, and the coaches and trainers are encouraged to engage with every individual that they come into contact with. And we talk about 2 points of feedback, one being a positive, so something that they're good at as an individual, and just one area that they've noticed in that skill or game, which is an area that they could look to improve on and take something away to think about. Within that process, within those days, the kids come along and there's no numbers on them, there's no numbers to attach to them, and the coaches and trainers need to get to know every individual that comes through them by name, so it becomes quite personable. The coaches and trainers then just assess, based on what they've observed and how they've interacted with those individuals that come through, just what do those players, what are their further development needs? What does it look like for them? And they look at 3 main areas. And the first one is the person that they've engaged with. So what is the person holding the hockey stick like? What is their attitude towards learning? Do they seek feedback? Do they take it on well? Are they comfortable trying new things and not necessarily afraid of failure? Are they engaged, but maybe they're just a bit quiet and a bit shy, but you can sort of see the cogs turning in the background. So that's the first thing that we sort of shape up with the coaches and trainers. The second part is around athlete. What's their physical capability like? Are they athletic? Do they have good hand-eye coordination? Do they have different skills that you can observe that's probably come about from playing other sports that could transition and transfer into hockey? And then we look at the hockey player. What's their technical tact like at this aspect, at this stage? And that's the third aspect we really look at. The other 2 are more heavily weighted. So once we've gone through those development days with the players, they're divided up into 2 8-week programs, and they run on Sunday mornings. And there is a more structured technical tactical program relative to the needs for each program. So our Connect program runs for those 8 weeks, and that culminates in a 1-day sort of local festival. Our representative program, that comes together and finishes with a 3 or 4 day Lower North Island festival. For that, we don't create seeded teams, so there's no A and B teams, and we don't have a restriction on the amount of kids that can be in there. So we're not governed by a number of teams. We can have as many as required. So with that change in focus for the players, there's also a change in focus for coaches involved, and I think this is quite a key area. Now you're not applying to coach a team to go away to a tournament. You want to be involved as a coach in a development program. So instantly the focus now is on individual participant growth as opposed to going away to be successful in a tournament. So our in-season development program over the last 2 years has grown from that just over 100 number that we sort of touched on to this year we had over 170 individuals register for this year's program. There's constant reflection and refinement, I guess, and we've sort of shifted to where we want the program ultimately to look like for the individual participants, but also for coaches. We haven't got everything right in between there, and we're sort of working to backfill now some of the structures and some of the messaging that goes with our new approach. But we're sort of clear that this is like our priority area, and this is how we want our programs to look. And there's development opportunities now for anyone who wants one.
Yeah, look, some really great information there, Bjorn. And just to reinforce to the listeners tonight, these changes have been made over time, and even some simple things I'll pick up on there, like the shift from coaches nominating people to go to a trial to actually self-nomination, so anyone can come up and go through a process in which players are sort of grouped with mutual sort of ability groupings based on what you've seen, and you unpacked really well, the 3 areas, quite holistic in what you're looking at, and then actually everyone still then gets a development program. They're just in 2 different groupings, and then there's still an event and a competition at the end. So some really good information there for the listeners, as well as that really important point in terms of the shift of coaches and the changes in their behaviours from not taking a team away to working in more of a developmental pool. So really good to hear, Bjorn. Thank you for sharing that. I'll now sort of move into the secondary school space to Chris. So Chris mentioned at the start, you're a sport activator at Upper Hutt College. So you work with the school to support good practice within the school. But also alignment, across different sports, but also out into the community clubs in the Upper Hutt region. So, there's students, there's teachers, there's volunteers. Really like to hear about some of the work that you've been part of at Upper Hutt College.
Yeah, cool. So to start off, Upper Hutt College is a school of about 1,000 students in the Paradise in Wellington. That is Upper Hutt. And look, we don't have it perfect across the board and how we run things, but we definitely notice that we are on the track and we are improving. So a little indicator for that is the School Sport New Zealand census statistics. So currently our participation levels are up 12%, and that sort of coincides with the when we started to look a little bit differently about what sport looks like at our school and how it's offered to the kids. So I guess 12% doesn't sound like a huge number, but on the ground and in a practical sense, that's going from 1 or 2 futsal teams to 12, 5 basketball teams to 14 within that time frame. So we've obviously got increased amounts of kids wanting to play sport, and we've got kids who are now playing obviously more than the one sport as well. And I think changing the way that we administer, sort, and conduct our trials and sort our teams has been a massive contributor for that change. I think kind of what you're alluding to before, our old system, everyone that's on this call has probably been in it during their time at school, a little bit archaic. Everyone who registers must attend the trial. As you say, the coaches are flanking the sidelines armed with their clipboards and their pens. And then the first team coach would go and select their best 10 players. The second team coach would get the next 10, and so on and so forth. So what you were left with was a bit of a pecking order. So you had the kids who are getting told that they're really awesome, and then you were getting the kids that told that they really weren't. From there, the teams were quickly posted up onto the sports notice board, and then you'd see the kids sort of walk away either elated that they made the team that they wanted to make, or pretty deflated that they've missed out. And it would normally take only a couple of hours until those emails and phone calls that I mentioned earlier would start to roll in. But looking at it now, as you mentioned before as well, we've definitely got a more student-centered approach, and it's a lot less rigid. So I think we know the students a lot better now. We know that they all have different drivers or reasons to why they want to participate. And they all want to consume their sport in a different way. So completely different from one player to the next at the same age. So we've identified that, noticed that we need to change the way that we're offering things to meet the demand there. So whether it be completely unstructured opportunities that the kids just come and grab some equipment and go and set up their own game, some social teams getting set up, some semi-social teams, and then obviously the competitive students. So Just to highlight in there as well, like competitive sport is still cool, and there are plenty of kids that still want that kind of experience. But now we only hold trials for those teams that do want to play in the competitive side. So the rest of the kids, we work with them to sort of identify their friends groups that they can make teams up with, and enter them into a grade that sort of suits their ability and their ambition on where they want to play. But I guess the tricky part comes from if you get someone whose driver to participate is to develop and be better within their sport, and they want that competitive nature, and they miss out. It's how do you support them? And it's a case by case basis, but it could be they come along and attend some of the first team trainings, or could be involved in a match day squad, or even if it's just the coaches of those teams are keeping tabs on their development and keeping those lines of communication open. I think with the approach that we've run with at the moment, it's obviously not only seen an increase in participation for our kids, but I tell you what, the pastoral and the incident related emails have come down a lot. So there's a lot less dramas within the teams themselves. They're all groups of mates, so there's not too many kids taking the hump and leaving mid-season. And the other key one for us is that the logistics are actually a lot better. So chances are, if the kids are mates, that the parents have some idea of who one another is. So just practical things like getting kids to away games or to trainings. And finding parents to volunteer to be coaches, managers, referees, it's become a lot easier. But as I say, we're not at 100%, but we definitely think we're in an improved space since we sort of go for the student-centered approach.
Hey, Chris, some wonderful work there, and just picking up on a few things. Well, first, congratulations to see that participation increase, and I'm sure that comes with other measures of, it's linked to how the quality experience sort of measures in terms of how reflects on the school environment, how the kids are feeling. A couple of things I picked up there were, one was, yes, you are still having the competitive opportunities, but you're offering other places for young people to play, which haven't always been the case. So it's understanding their motivations and working with those. The other thing I did here too was the flexibility. Like, there's always a line that's drawn sometimes, and there's a number that get put on teams or squads. But I heard that, there's some flexibility there, and you're looking at ways to understand how we can sort of push those boundaries out to meet the individual needs. Hey, look, there's some really some good questions starting to flow through in the chat function. Dave, before I go to you, I was just going to push a couple of questions to Bjorn and Chris, if you don't mind. So one, I'll steer to Bjorn first. This is from Victoria Lamb. Do you find a difference in genders in the way selection processes are managed, Bjorn?
Yeah, we have found that our approach that we've brought on board probably appeals more to female athletes, so young girls. They feel, I think, probably less pressure or less fear of failure, and they're more willing to put themselves forward and be involved in the programs. Whereas sometimes potentially with the boys, they might have felt that it might not be as competitive for them. So we're trying to tinker with our programs just to make sure we continue to evolve and cover off what those main drivers are. So there is a difference between young boys and young girls, we've found.
Great. Yeah. So again, every sport and will have different sort of findings in this space. And Chris, one for you here. This is from Rob. Would you recommend a school holds trials for sports before everyone that wants to participate registers, or after everybody that wants to participate has registered their interest?
Yeah, cool. So I think getting that aspect of knowledge on how many kids you've got interested in playing the sport is key. So I'd say have your registrations first, and I'll probably allude to it a little bit more later on, but try and get as much information as you can about the kids, and you can even have it in there what sort of level they're looking at wanting to participate. So from there, you've got an opportunity to go and have a chat with those kids who have registered to get to know them a bit better. But then likewise, once the trials have been held, as you said before, that flexibility is key to allow kids who want to play the sport, they might have missed the trial. How do you factor them in? So yeah, I think we're all in these positions that we're in because we want to see as many kids playing as possible. So like you say, that flexibility and moving that firm line in the sand.
It's great. Thanks, Chris. So, Dave, I'm going to move to you now. And just again, to set the scene for everyone. So, as a high-performance athlete sort of development consultant, Dave works with sports, so, national sporting organisations here in New Zealand to support their good practice and planning around pathways. This includes, trial and selection processes. And you work in the space, what they call sort of pre-HP, so athletes that have future potential. They're not in high performance yet. They're starting to move into that performance space. So in some sports, this is starting to happen in the rangatahi sort of upper youth space. So Dave, in your work with sports, what are some of the things that you would connect with here in terms of, what good looks like?
Well, I think a big part of it, Alex, is the process, right? So, my role has been over the last couple of years to be a critical friend to those NSOs, to try and provoke thought, ask questions, but also put some rigor around ensuring that sports have a clear understanding of how many athletes they need to ensure a sustainable level of flow through the pathway. Now, pathway is a word that's, some people like, others don't, but it's a word. And I think that flow of athletes, whether that's filling retirements in a team sport like the Black Sticks hockey, for example, or whether that's young swimmers coming through with Swimming New Zealand and some of the things that they're doing, it's ensuring that there's enough athletes in the system and they're getting the appropriate support at the right time. Now, the performance age in snow sports, for example, could be very different to what it looks like in rowing or equestrian or other sports where there could be a real variety in age or a higher performance age. So I guess some of the things that we do to support, we have a sort of biannual system that we call the Effective Systems Tool, which is a review of sorts, but we use it as definitely not compliance, more around a conversation to say to sports, look, what are you doing? What are your processes against a series of criteria? So that could be leadership, that could be what the pathway looks like, it could be selection processes. When it comes to the selection process, what we want to see is that there's transparency in that process. There's rationale behind what they're doing. There's evidence around good practice, as you've touched on in the question, but also multiple entry and exit points. And at the level we're working at with athletes that are potentially just entering the high performance pathway or that area, we are looking at potential. So again, the system needs to be wide enough to allow a window of time to look at athletes within that sport. And the support needs to be appropriate for where they are in their development. Now, that could be very light touch with athletes that are just entering in that pre-HP space. That might be in the form of some consults with Athlete Life through high performance sport. It might be through some online resources through high performance sport. And of course, there might be some funding that goes into the sport to provide camps, which will then give opportunities to either train or create let's say more competitive daily training environments for those athletes who need to be dipped in. So there's really, I guess, a lot of rigor and process around how we look at sports, and what every sport does is quite different. The needs of those sports is different. And as I say, snow sports is a great example of a sport where we know that athletes are peaking a lot earlier, and they're doing some really awesome work around ensuring that their athletes have a diverse experience in the form of transferable skills, using skate and surf within their sports to avoid the early specialization piece. They've got some great expertise on that in there. And of course, you've got sports like swimming, which are making some changes in their programs to, I guess, put the emphasis more on fun at the under 12s and those younger ages, and then also look at things like relative age effect and shift the calendar and the selections and try and push the age up a little bit, with a focus on prioritizing perhaps the older athletes and allowing those younger ones more time to develop. So again, it can look very, very different across different sports.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I think there's, as you say there, every sport needs to understand their sort of journey and have their evidence. And a sport like snow sports, you speak to, is probably the minority rather than the majority. And a lot of others, it's a sort of a later point. And, keeping that base sort of wide to make more informed decisions later on, rather than sort of back to our point we made earlier around every individual developing at different rates. Just probably picking up recently, many people have probably seen an article on the recent Women's US Open winner. Tennis, a sport that probably has been connected with an earlier specialisation piece, but profiling her journey in terms of doing other things like you mentioned in some sports there. So opening up those environments, doing things differently and starting to specialise a little bit later, and the benefit that comes from that. Look, so what we've sort of touched on there, hopefully there's so quite a bit of information that's come through the discussion. So thank you all. Like, there's so much more, and actually I'm looking at a lot of the questions coming through the chat function. We're trying to connect with as many as we can, but I think there's going to be a lot more content here that we may need to consider and then actually have additional webinars on some of these areas that are raised. But there's just another poll that should have popped up, or should be popping up on your screens now. So this one, actually connects with some of the questions that are raised. So as a listener, if you were to go and look for more information on trial and selection processes, where would you go? So we're just really keen to understand, what sort of places that you're all looking in. Are you looking on your NSO's websites? Are you going to your regional sporting organisation, Sport New Zealand, Balance is Better, or other places? Because it is something when we've started to look into, there's not a lot of information out there sometimes. So it'll help us sort of help the New Zealand sports system as well. So coming through a combination of Sport New Zealand website, Balance is Better, as well as sort of the NSOs and RSOs. So Sport New Zealand getting quite a few looks there, which is great. So look, now we're going to move into the sort of third section of tonight's conversation, which is sort of the practical reality. So, there's a lot of great things we've discussed, and I think, many golden nuggets that I hope you're all picking up and thinking again around what does this mean for your environment, understanding the environment that you work in and what you could do to sort of improve what's already happening. So what I'm very mindful of, I've got 3 kids, they're coming through different sports pathways, is, quite often we know what we could or should do. So even at home, I should water blast my house to get rid of some of the mold. I'm going to get another 3 years out of my house before I've got to paint it. It's going to cost, it's going to save me money, but I haven't done it. And, this is the same sort of conversation sometimes in youth sport. We often know what we should do, but we don't. We're all busy. We're trying to change what's always been in place. Like a traditional process is hard. To do some of these things takes more time. It takes more money and resources sometimes that we don't have. So we'll just keep doing what we're doing. And, this is where we've got to do better for our young people, our rangatahi that are out there. So what we're going to do now in this last sort of section is discuss some practical realities and some scenarios that are out there that probably a lot of people engaging tonight sort of are familiar with and they're working in. So to kick off, Bjorn, I'm going to come back to you. So as you've made some of the changes that you discussed earlier in Wellington hockey, how have you found the perception that players are actually missing out on development and not being extended by putting in a wider sort of development program that's not a representative team going away like it would have been in the past? So you've taken a different approach to trials and selections. How have you dealt with some of that pushback or that perception?
Yeah, look, that is real. There are players that do miss out on the rep program who decide not to be part of our Connect program, whether that's the child or the parent decides that. I must admit, this year, there's a lot less. So last year, we probably would have had about a 50% drop-off. This year, it's probably down to less than 20%. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's been a big shift this year. I guess for them, it's just about continuing to build our programs and the quality of what we deliver. I think that's really important, so that when whatever program people end up in, that they perceive that they are going to get value and they are going to get that development opportunity, whether it is the rep or the Connect program. We do aim to provide the best youth coaches we can into our Connect program. We think that's really, really important. We're also always reviewing that program to ensure that the athletes stay motivated and engaged, and it's not a set in a program that's set for the full 8 weeks. It's evolved depending on the group. One area we can be better just to help all of this is, particularly with parents, is better at sharing our messaging and engaging with them and explaining why we're doing it and bringing them along the journey with us. Just because they haven't made the rep program, it doesn't mean in our eyes that their child has a low ceiling or that they're not going to get what they need out of this program. So it's really important that we communicate that, and that is one area that we do acknowledge that we need to do better.
Yeah, thanks, Bjorn. I think that this theme of communication is coming up, and I'm seeing it in the chat function too, both pre, during, post. Dave, you mentioned it in terms of transparency as well, which has a lot to do with communication. So something here that is critical in these processes. And again, as we said earlier, sometimes we don't get it right, but we're aware of it and we've got to do better, which is great. Chris, I've got a question for you, and actually it's a question that's been raised by a few people in the chat function. Catherine Ratcliffe, it's sort of in a similar frame to what you've raised here, but let's put a practical reality in place. You're in a school setting, you're pressed for time. You've got either two coaches or maybe two volunteer coaches. You've got 80 to 100 year 9 students that have turned up for a netball trial. Choose a sport: netball, football, hockey, whatever it might be. They all think they're future ferns, whatever it might be. What do you do? And especially when these are year 9 students that the school doesn't know too well, because they've, in many cases they've come from intermediate. So, how do you work through some of those practical realities?
Yeah, look, if we had a 80 turn up for a competitive trial, I'd be pretty shocked if I'm honest. As I said before, our trials aren't come one, come all. But if we did have 80, that would mean we've got 80 kids that are super keen to play, I've got my communication wrong along the line somewhere. So I guess to strip it back, at the registration phase of a season, we try and get as much information about the kids that we're going to have on our online regos. We want to know that their sort of current ability level, teams that they're playing for, any rep teams, all that sort of stuff, what kind of level they want to play. Are there any friends that they want to play with? And that can start to give us an idea to get a bit of skeleton team sort of in our head. And in terms of year 9s that you mentioned, we're quite fortunate, and I'm not sure if everyone in their communities are the same, but we've got quite strong links with our clubs. So quite easy to get in touch with a grade convener or whatever their title is, just to get an idea on the kids that are transitioning from the intermediates from our feeder schools into our school, to see what the levels is going to be. From the registration process, then we all have a meeting at school with the kids. Again, we talk over the options around the social opportunities, the unstructured stuff, and that's where we start putting more teams together. If there's a couple of friends groups that want to play together, we start to merge them, and then once we've got that competitive trial list, if you like, sorted, us as a sports department would then liaise with the coaches to pass on other information about the students that might be trialing. So again, as you talked about before, looking at the whole student, looking at their personal strengths, weaknesses, to get into those top teams. For us, it's more than just what they do on the pitch. It's that coachability, like we saw in the questions before in the chat function. Do they demonstrate and role model the values that we expect and want for our first team players, and do they have the ability to role model it throughout the school as well, which would be a massive bonus. So I guess in terms of the scenario, bringing it back, if they all did turn up, I'd reiterate, look, there are other options, but hey, look, if we had 80 that wanted to play, we'd just roll our sleeves up and get on with it. So that would look like, obviously, we'd have more than the one trial, because to try and view them all and give them a fair crack of the whip would be pretty tough. And as we went forward, those numbers would whittle down, and at each reduction of the numbers, we'd be having those conversations with the students that have missed out, to find out what opportunities that we could put them into that suit their needs. So it would be a hard task, but we'd get on with it.
Yeah, and I think these are practical realities that people on the webinar tonight are faced with. And again, some of these, they don't have simple answers. It's trying to think of how we use coaches, making sure that, at a simple level, that there's still a place for people to play, and you don't shut that door straight away. You open them back up next season, and some of those things as well, how you message those things. Dave, I'm going to come to you, and this is an area that's actually also come up in the chat function. So we've talked a lot, we tend to lean into team sports and team environments when we think about trials and selections. With your hat on, you work into a lot of sports that aren't team sports, individual sports. How, is there anything different in an individual sport where, time and other factors come in a lot? I'm thinking swimming and athletics. Any learnings from working with individual sports?
Yeah, look, I'll dive into the team side first, and then I'll elaborate on that, Alex. My background's in football prior to HPSNZ, and I've been lucky to work in the professional academy scene in the UK, particularly, where individualized programs are the bread and butter of those clubs. And there are lots of things within that system which are far from perfect, but there's lots of excellent examples of how team sports can be individualized. So whether that's being really clear with young athletes around having an individual plan, and for young kids, that could be as simple as, hey, what are you really good at, and what would you like to work on? And then from there, we've got a conversation that we can have every week at training. So within team sports, I think it is important that we do look at that as we are developing individuals or giving an experience to every individual in the group as best we can. When it comes to those CGS sports, or centimeters, grams, and seconds, we're obviously talking about sports where performance can be measured, and it doesn't matter whether you're a 12-year-old swimming in a pool or an 18-year-old running on a track. There's still times involved, right? So a lot of the challenges with development are that we've got to live in the grey, and we've got to be comfortable with that. And we also live in a really data-driven world, whereas adults, we always want to measure everything and make things a black and white science, when we've got to accept that when working with young people and working in sports systems, there is a lot of grey, and we need to have that longer window. I'm lucky to do a lot of work with Swimming New Zealand, and the guys there, as I mentioned earlier, are making some changes around how they look at age groups, how they look at the calendar year. They're focusing really at Swimming New Zealand on trying to become the most skillful swimming nation in the world, and the conduit for Swimming New Zealand to do that is through coach education. So they're really trying to upskill the coaches who are out there around how they can, develop more skillful athletes. And how they can combat things like relative age effect. And the HPAD leader in that sport is really looking into things like peak height velocity, and growth and maturation, to understand that when they're looking at athletes in that sport, obviously, if you've got a 14-year-old swimmer who's very physically mature, then they're probably going to be stronger and faster at that point on the journey. But teaching and supporting coaches to understand that maybe you've got a really skillful swimmer in this group who has not yet even hit that maturation point, who needs the right time and support wrapped around them, can be a really important thing. So I can't sit here and say there's one answer for that, but I think when it comes to those sports where there is a measurement in play, you need to be able to look at things like character, like coachability that we've talked about, which again it can be ambiguous because it's open to, debate as to what coachability even means. But character traits, let's say, or behaviors when you're starting to get to the performance end. So what are some of those behaviors that we could look for from there? And then the final piece of that is that a lot of these sports, again, that are measuring or have times involved or centimeters and grams, they'll also, when selecting athletes, go through a process of application. So swimming is one, when it goes further up the pathway, and rowing for certain support for athletes at different stages of the pathway. The athletes might actually have to apply and present themselves to a panel to say, look, we know what you can go do out in the boat or in the pool, but we want to know a little bit more about you. And what are some of the things that might come through in those discussions? And obviously coaches and the sport itself will have a huge influence on that selection. But it's important to look at more than just the time. So black and white's really easy. And from an administrative perspective, it's great because it makes things easy for us to manage, whether we're organizing 100 kids at a hockey trial or whether we're selecting athletes for funding. But we've got to be comfortable with the gray, and we've got to accept that there's not always going to be answers that are that clear to us.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Look, really good examples there in an individual sporting sense. I'm scanning the chat function. We're on the home straight now, everyone. We're getting close. A theme that keeps reoccurring is communication. So probably a message I'd have to people on the call, and we talk about pre, during, and post. you'll need to understand the context you're working in. When you're further down working with larger numbers, then an individual conversation sometimes is a bit harder if there's hundreds of kids. So I think ensuring then if it's emails or whatever that go out to parents, that they're really carefully managed and well worded. You're connecting with the fact that the door's not closed, it can open again, and what will happen, so they understand it's not the door's shut from there on. Sending them links and connecting them with stories of athletes that, everyone knows the Michael Jordan story, and there's other New Zealand athletes that have similar stories, so that they understand that actually, a bit of grit and resilience is important too. When we get further up into sort of some of Dave's space, when you're working with smaller numbers, you can take more time. There is a lot more dialogue and discussion with athletes and comms too. So the role parents play down in Bjorn and Chris's space versus probably in Dave's space is sort of different too, where the comms is usually through the athlete higher up, where we're talking to, participants, rangatahi and their parents earlier down. So I just wanted to pick up on that because it's come through loud and clear throughout the call. So look, we are sort of got to tie the bow and close the loop here tonight, everyone. And, we've got to give you a bit of time to get your Netflix fix for the evening or a chance to read your favourite book. But a huge thank you for your engagement. There's been some wonderful questions that have come up in the chat function where we will go back through them and look at what we may have missed and try to connect with some of those topics. Just to remind you, this basic framework that's been up in the background was just a way of looking at some simple considerations that have come up through the conversations and the work that Bjorn, Chris and Dave have spoken to, just ensuring that the athlete is first in all of our thinking, pre, during and post. Also, really important to go, actually, is there a purpose? Is there a need for this? And then thinking about the environment and the systems that are involved. So, please keep that front and center as you're working through the great work that you do with young people. Look, I'd just like to thank Bjorn, Chris and Dave for sharing your wisdom and jumping into this conversation tonight, not just tonight on the call, but in our catch-ups beforehand. So a little pucky under your desks at home and thank our panel for sharing some of their wisdom. And a huge thank you to you all at home for tuning in, taking time out of your evening. And also a huge thank you for actually what you do in youth sport, the fact that you're engaged, you're doing your best to look after the needs of our young people, and sport's such a great vehicle to grow people. So, look, we hope you take away some information to support your mahi and the work that you do. I think we've talked about the complexity of the space. It gets pretty challenging, so we've unpacked a bit there. Hopefully you've pulled some golden nuggets in terms of what good can look like or what better would look like, regardless of whether you're a coach, administrator or a parent. And look, if you haven't already, please sign up to the Balance is Better website. There's a regular newsletter and there'll be information pushed out. This is just one of a series of webinars, so there'll be a few more rolling out over the next few weeks. I'd now just like to close with a karakia. So, te taua mai runga, te taua mai raro, te taua mai roto, te taua mai waho, kia tau ai te Māori tū, kia tau ai te Māori ora, tutu whakamaua, kia tina, homie, huie, tāheki. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou tātua. Thank you.